On June 25, 2025, the state of Mississippi carried out the execution of Richard Gerald Jordan, a 79-year-old man who had been on death row for nearly half a century. His name is now marked in history as one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the United States. What began as a tragic and calculated act in 1976 eventually became a decades-long legal saga, and now, a final chapter has closed. In this video, we delve into the dark events that led to Jordan's death sentence, the chilling details of the crime he committed, the lengthy judicial process that followed, and the final moments of a man whose fate was sealed by a brutal decision. Made almost 50 years ago, Richard Gerald Jordan was once a decorated Vietnam War veteran. He served with distinction, completing 3 combat tours as a helicopter gunner. But back in civilian life, the man who had survived the horrors of war would soon become the architect of a tragedy that would destroy a family and haunt a community for decades. In January 1976, Jordan set in motion a heartless kidnapping murder scheme fueled by financial desperation. He contacted a bank in Gulfport, Mississippi, pretending to inquire about a loan. During the call, he asked to speak to a loan officer, and when he was told that Charles Martyr was available, he abruptly ended the call. That detail alone was enough for Jordan to begin his sinister plan. Using a phone directory, he looked up the address of the Martyr family, Charles, his wife Edwina, and their 2 young children. Jordan drove to their home, posed as a utility worker from the local electric company, and claimed he needed to inspect the breakers inside the house. His disguise and calm demeanor earned him entry without suspicion. Once inside, he abducted 34-year-old Edwina Martyr, forcing her to leave behind her sleeping 3-year-old son. Her older son, just 10 years old, was away at school that day. Entirely unaware that his family's life was about to change forever, Jordan took Edwina to a secluded area deep within the DeSoto National Forest in Harrison County. It was there, in a cold and calculated moment, that he executed her with a gunshot to the back of the head. The forensic evidence later confirmed that the bullet entered the base of her skull and exited just above her left eye, a clear indication that she was shot from behind, likely while kneeling or unaware. The cruelty of the act was staggering. After committing the murder, Jordan tossed the murder weapon into the Big Biloxi River in an effort to conceal the evidence. However, a police dive team would later recover the weapon from the water. What makes the case even more disturbing is what happened next. Despite having already taken Edwina's life, Jordan called her husband, Charles Martyr, back at the bank. He lied, claiming that Edwina was alive and being held hostage. He demanded $25,000 in ransom, money that he knew Charles would be desperate to provide if it meant saving his wife. This manipulation only deepened the trauma for the Martyr family, who would later learn that Edwina had been dead even before that call was made. Richard Gerald Jordan was swiftly arrested, tried, and convicted for the heinous crime. But his legal journey would stretch on for nearly 5 decades, entangled in appeals, retrials, and procedural delays. He would go on to become the longest-serving inmate on death row in Mississippi's history. Many questioned whether the justice system had failed to bring timely closure to such a brutal case, while others debated the morality and effectiveness of keeping a man on death row for almost 50 years before finally carrying out the sentence. As Jordan's execution date approached, media attention surged. Journalists gathered to cover what was both an end and a reminder of a crime so devastating that its wounds had never fully healed. In the hours before his death, Jordan was offered his final meal and allowed a final statement. What he chose to say or not say remains a critical piece in how history will remember him. His story, both tragic and terrifying, is one that reminds us how one man's decision can ripple through generations, forever altering the course of multiple lives. Even after taking Edwina Martyr's life in a brutal and calculated act, Richard Gerald Jordan continued his heartless deception. He reached out to Charles Martyr the same evening, feigning concern and falsely assuring him that Edwina was still alive and unharmed. Speaking with chilling composure, Jordan demanded a ransom payment of $25,000 and gave specific instructions. The money was to be wrapped in brown paper and placed atop a blue jacket along U.S. Highway 49. Charles, desperate to ensure the safe return of his wife, followed the instructions to the letter. But when he arrived at the drop-off point, he saw no jacket and no sign of Jordan. Unbeknownst to him, Jordan had been observing from a distance and spotted that federal agents were following Charles' car. Fearing capture, he aborted the pickup and vanished into the night. The next morning, Jordan called again, his voice calm, his lies unwavering. Once more, he reassured Charles that Edwina was safe, even asking tenderly about the children, further manipulating a grieving and panicked husband. This time, he gave a new location for the drop, a spot along Interstate 10. Charles complied again, leaving the ransom at the designated location in the desperate hope that his wife might still be alive. Jordan retrieved the money, but as soon as he did, plainclothes officers moved in to arrest him. What followed was a dangerous high-speed chase in which Jordan managed to force the officer's vehicle off the road and escape. His freedom was short-lived. Jordan abandoned his car in a shopping center parking lot and took the precaution of hiding most of the ransom money in a nearby wooded area, keeping only a small amount. With that money, he purchased a change of clothes to avoid detection and called a taxi to help him get away. However, his escape ended at a police roadblock. One of the officers immediately recognized Jordan and took him into custody without further incident. It was at this point that Jordan, perhaps exhausted by the manhunt, confessed to the crime. He fully cooperated with investigators, leading them to the site in DeSoto National Forest where Edwina Martyr's body lay, and even directed them to the location where he had discarded the murder weapon, a critical piece of evidence later recovered by police divers from the Big Biloxi River. In 1976, Jordan was tried and sentenced to death for his crimes. But that, as it turned out, was only the beginning of a legal odyssey that would stretch for nearly 50 years. His initial death sentence was vacated after a landmark Supreme Court ruling declared that automatic death sentences were unconstitutional. This required a new sentencing hearing, and in 1977, Jordan once again received the death penalty. Yet, his legal team mounted a successful appeal, and that sentence too was overturned. Jordan was then tried a third time and sentenced to death once more. But in an astonishing twist of legal fate, this third sentence was also vacated, plunging the case into further complexity and delay. To resolve the increasingly drawn-out case, prosecutors offered Jordan a plea bargain, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, in exchange for permanently waiving his right to further appeals. Jordan accepted the agreement, but years later, he filed a new legal challenge. He argued that under Mississippi law in 1976, a sentence of life without parole was not a legally available option. The courts reviewed the case and agreed. The plea deal was ruled invalid, and in 1998, a fourth and final sentencing hearing was held. Once again, Jordan was sentenced to death. Over the decades, Jordan's defense team consistently emphasized his mental health struggles, particularly his history of severe trauma resulting from military service. Jordan had served in one of the bloodiest phases of the Vietnam War, including during the 1968 Tet Offensive at Phu Bai near the ancient city of Huc. After his service, he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), a condition that his lawyers argued had never been fully or fairly presented to the jury during his early trials. They maintained that the psychological damage inflicted by war had profoundly altered his mental state and could have impacted the jury's decision on sentencing had they been properly informed. Despite these arguments and the years of appeals, the courts upheld the final sentence. Richard Gerald Jordan's case remains one of the most prolonged and legally entangled capital punishment cases in modern American history. It raises ongoing debates about the death penalty, mental health in the justice system, and the effectiveness of decades-long incarceration on death row. Had the jury been fully aware of Richard Gerald Jordan's traumatic combat experiences and the psychological toll it had taken on him, it is possible that he might not have received a death sentence. His defense team argued that his years of military service, particularly his involvement in the 1968 Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War, had left him deeply scarred. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, Jordan had never truly recovered from what he had witnessed and endured on the battlefield. However, those factors were not properly presented during his early trials, and decades later, they could not overturn the verdict that had already been cemented in the eyes of the law. The final chapter in Jordan's long legal saga began when Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves signed his death warrant, setting the execution date for June 25, 2025. The governor made it clear that justice, delayed for nearly half a century, would now be served. On June 23, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Jordan's final appeals, removing the last legal obstacle that could have postponed his execution. With no further options remaining, preparations began for one of the most anticipated executions in Mississippi's modern history. On the morning of his execution, Richard Gerald Jordan woke at 6 a.m. at the Mississippi State Penitentiary. In Parkman, he was granted time to meet with his family, attorneys, and spiritual advisors, spending his final hours surrounded by those closest to him. His family was allowed to remain with him until 2 p.m., after which he was moved to a separate holding cell to await the scheduled procedure. For his final meal, Jordan chose a modest selection: chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float, a quiet farewell to a life he had spent nearly 49 years confined within prison walls. At 4 p.m., he was escorted to an isolation cell, and by 6:16 p.m., the execution by lethal injection commenced. Observers noted that he experienced light convulsions for about 3 to 5 minutes following the administration of the drugs, a reaction seen in some executions using Mississippi's controversial 3-drug protocol. He was pronounced dead at 6:23 p.m. by the attending physician. At 79 years old, Jordan had become the longest-serving death row inmate in Mississippi history, a man whose life behind bars had spanned almost 5 decades before the drugs were administered. Jordan was offered the opportunity to speak one final time. He said, "First of all, I want to thank everyone for the humane way this was done. I want to apologize to the victim's family. I love you all very much. I will see you on the other side, all of you." His last words left the room divided. Some viewed them as a sincere expression of remorse, while others interpreted his tone as ambiguous or even sarcastic. Especially amid ongoing debates over the ethical use of the lethal injection protocol employed in Mississippi, a method that he and other inmates had legally challenged as cruel and unusual punishment. Jordan was only the 3rd person to be executed in Mississippi over the past decade. Following the state's previous execution in December 2022, his death reignited discussions about capital punishment and the long delays between sentencing and execution. For the Martyr family, particularly Edwina Martyr's two sons, who were just children when she was taken from them, the execution marked the conclusion of a 49-year wait for justice. The older son, Eric Martyr, who was 11 at the time of the murder and is now 59, publicly stated that neither he nor his younger brother, now 49, would attend the execution. For them, no punishment could undo the pain that had been part of their lives since 1976. The execution of Richard Gerald Jordan ended a nearly half-century-long legal journey marked by trials, appeals, and delays. Yet, while the legal process has now reached its conclusion, the emotional impact of the crime, for the victim's family, for Jordan's own loved ones, and for those who followed the case, will remain long after the headlines fade.